In the quiet marshlands of Nova Scotia, wind moves through the reeds like the echo of a lost people. Beneath the surface of this calm, a story still stirs. A story of the first Europeans in North America to be torn from their homeland, scattered across continents, and nearly erased from memory. Yet their DNA still whispers across two oceans. They were called the Acadians, and their genetic mystery is rewriting what we thought we knew about identity, exile, and survival. The Acadians were among the earliest settlers of New France, arriving in the early 1600s. They carved farms out of tidal marshes, built dikes against the Bay of Fundy's powerful tides, and created a life of remarkable peace with their Kmaq neighbors. For more than a century, they lived apart from the wars and politics of Europe, forming a new culture and dialect, distinct from both French and English. They called their homeland Acadie. But in 1755, that peace was shattered. British soldiers arrived with orders that would echo through generations. The Acadians were to be expelled. Families were torn apart, homes burned, and over 11,000 men, women, and children were loaded onto ships, sent to distant ports from Boston to France, even to the Caribbean. It was one of the first mass deportations of Europeans in North America, a forced diaspora long before the word refugee existed. For 2 centuries, the Acadian story survived mostly through legend, most famously immortalized in Longfellow's poem Evangeline. But now, DNA is filling in the silence that history left behind. Before we uncover what those genetic tests have revealed, remember, this is where history meets science, where family stories become evidence written in code. And if uncovering forgotten ancestry fascinates you, make sure to subscribe to GenealogyX, where DNA brings lost lineages back to life. The Acadian genetic story begins with isolation. Early settlers came from a handful of small French villages, mostly from Poitou, Anjou, and Brittany. Geneticists studying Acadian descendants found a unique combination of Western European haplogroups, particularly R1b among men and H and U5 among maternal lines. But because the colony was so small and families intermarried for generations, the Acadian genome became unusually concentrated, what scientists call a founder effect. This means that a small number of original settlers left an outsized genetic signature that persists to this day. That's where the story takes a surprising turn. When researchers began comparing Acadian DNA with that of modern French Canadians, they found differences unexpected for 2 groups that once shared the same origins. Acadians, it turns out, carry certain genetic markers closer to those found in early Breton and Norman populations than in most Quebecois. In other words, the Acadian population represents a frozen snapshot of 17th century French ancestry, one that no longer exists in France itself. Even more intriguing are the traces of Indigenous DNA found among Acadian descendants. Historical records mention intermarriages with Mi'kmaq women, especially in the early years when few French women were present. Modern DNA analysis supports this. Mitochondrial lineages typical of Indigenous North Americans, such as haplogroup A2, appear in a small but significant percentage of Acadian descendants today. It's living proof of a cultural blending that history books rarely acknowledged. But the most astonishing revelation comes from what happened after the deportation, the Grand Dérangement. Scattered across the Atlantic world, some Acadian families found themselves in France, others in New England, the Caribbean, or Louisiana. Each branch evolved differently, creating regional genetic fingerprints. In Louisiana, Acadians became Cajuns. Genetic testing shows Cajun DNA as a complex mosaic, Acadian French at its core, but with strong additions from Spanish settlers, Africans, and Native Americans. Over centuries, isolation in the Louisiana bayous preserved these blended genes as a distinct population. So distinct, in fact, that geneticists can often identify Cajun ancestry through unique marker combinations that trace back directly to 18th century Acadia. In contrast, Acadians who returned to Canada or France often married into local populations, diluting the original signature. But because genealogical records were meticulously kept by priests and notaries, researchers can map how specific surnames LeBlanc, Thibodeau, Kmaq, and Doucet moved across continents. Today, DNA tests confirm that many people who identify as Cajun, French Canadian, or even New Englander share those same ancestral signatures. So, who truly are the descendants of the Acadians? The answer lies in both genetics and resilience. Every Acadian line that survived carries proof that cultural identity can outlive exile. Their genes not only survived forced migration, they adapted, spread, and re-emerged generations later in places the original settlers never imagined. One of the most compelling genetic findings is the unusually high frequency of certain rare hereditary conditions within Acadian-descended populations. Because of the founder effect, some recessive traits became concentrated. Geneticists have identified several conditions, such as Tay-Sachs and a rare form of congenital deafness, occurring more often among Acadian or Cajun families than in the general population. These discoveries, while medically important, also tell a deeper story, that even the challenges coded in our DNA carry traces of our ancestors' journeys. Consider the Acadian diaspora's emotional cost. Imagine being forced from your homeland, with only the clothes you wore, separated from parents, children, or spouses, some sent to England, others to Virginia or the Caribbean, never to reunite. DNA now reconnects some of those broken branches. Families who thought their lines were lost forever have discovered distant cousins across continents through shared genetic markers. Would you want to know if your DNA carries traces of a lost exile? Proof that your ancestors survived one of history's earliest deportations? What would that change about how you see yourself? Perhaps the greatest twist of the Acadian genetic story is that, despite centuries of dispersion, their DNA has proven extraordinarily persistent. Modern mapping by the Acadian Ancestral Project shows that many Acadian surnames maintain identifiable haplogroup clusters even today. This means that 260 years after the Grand Dérangement, scientists can still trace living descendants back to the original settlers of Port Royal in 1605. Few other populations on Earth show that level of genetic continuity after such trauma. There's also a darker scientific curiosity here: how displacement reshapes DNA diversity. Because so many Acadian families were split, intermarrying within smaller circles over generations, genetic bottlenecks formed. In Louisiana, the combination of isolation and endogamy created what researchers call a genetic island, a population with distinct allele frequencies compared to surrounding regions. That makes Cajuns and Acadians invaluable for medical research, offering insights into how isolated populations evolve over time. But beyond data and science, the DNA carries something intangible: proof of endurance. Despite being erased from maps, the Acadians could not be erased from memory or from the molecular record written in their descendants. Every double helix carrying their markers is a small act of defiance against oblivion. When scientists overlay Acadian migration routes with genetic data, a haunting pattern emerges: a web stretching from France to Nova Scotia, then radiating outwards to New England, the Caribbean, and Louisiana, looping back again through the Atlantic to Brittany and Poitou. It's the map of a people scattered by history, reunited by genetics. And yet there is still mystery. Some Acadian UY chromosome lines don't match any known European or Indigenous reference population. Where did these come from? Were they the result of undocumented marriages or remnants of even older migrations into France before the colonists departed? The answers lie deep in data still being decoded. Each new genetic test adds another piece of the puzzle of who the Acadians truly were and who they became. The irony is powerful. A people once deported to erase their existence are now among the most studied genealogical populations in North America. Their forced scattering became the reason their DNA spans so much of the continent. The very act meant to destroy their identity ensured it would endure everywhere. If this journey through the lost genetics of the Acadians has opened your eyes to how DNA preserves what history tried to bury, remember to subscribe to GenealogyX, where the stories of migration, survival, and forgotten ancestry are brought to life through science. As night settles over the marshlands of Nova Scotia, imagine the wind carrying the same songs the first settlers sang 4 centuries ago. The Acadian story lives on, not only in music, language, or culture, but in the cells of countless descendants who may never know that within them, the blood of exile still flows. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that our DNA remembers what history forgets. Somewhere in your own genome, an ancient echo may be waiting, a whisper of a people who refused to disappear, a message from the first deported Europeans in North America, still calling home across the centuries.